The rain hammered against the windows of Murphy's bar as the evening crowd settled in for another typical Friday night. The old establishment had been serving the community of Cedar Falls for over 40 years, its worn wooden floors and faded photographs telling stories of countless celebrations and sorrows. Tonight, however, would be different from any other night in its long history. Marcus Thompson sat alone at the far end of the bar, his prosthetic leg hidden beneath dark jeans. The 28-year-old former Marine Corps sergeant traced the rim of his untouched beer with his finger, lost in thoughts that seemed to weigh heavier than the storm clouds outside. His brown eyes held a distant look that spoke of experiences far beyond his years, memories that played like old movies in his mind. 3 months had passed since Marcus returned to his hometown after losing his left leg to an improvised explosive device in Afghanistan. The physical therapy was progressing well, but the invisible wounds ran deeper than any doctor could reach with their instruments. Tonight marked his first attempt at returning to normal social life, something his counselor had strongly encouraged. The bar buzzed with conversation and laughter from the regular Friday night crowd. Construction workers, fresh off their shifts, mingled with office employees celebrating the end of another work week. The familiar sounds of clinking glasses and friendly banter created a symphony of small-town life that Marcus had once been part of, but now felt like a stranger observing from the outside. Near the pool table, a group of 5 young men in their early 20s dominated the space with loud voices and boisterous behavior. They wore expensive designer clothes and gold chains that caught the dim bar lighting. Their leader, a tall blond man named Derek Michaels, commanded attention wherever he went. His father owned the largest construction company in town, and Derek had never known a day of real struggle in his privileged life. Derek's crew consisted of his closest friends from high school who had stayed in Cedar Falls while others left for college or military service. There was Tommy, short and stocky with a permanent smirk. Jake, thin and nervous, always eager to please Derek. Brad, the quiet follower who rarely spoke but never missed an opportunity to laugh at others' expense, and Ryan, Derek's cousin, equally spoiled and equally arrogant. The group had been drinking heavily for the past 2 hours, their voices growing louder and their jokes becoming more inappropriate with each round. They seemed to believe the entire bar existed for their entertainment, making crude comments about other patrons and treating the waitress with casual disrespect that made her visibly uncomfortable. Marcus tried to ignore their behavior, focusing instead on the baseball game playing silently on the television above the bar. The familiar ritual of watching sports had once brought him comfort, but now even simple pleasures felt different, tainted by the changes war had brought to his life. As the evening progressed, Derek's attention began to wander around the room, searching for new sources of amusement. His eyes settled on Marcus, sitting alone and seemingly lost in thought. Derek whispered something to his friends, causing them to turn and look in Marcus's direction with growing interest. "Hey, look at that guy over there," Derek said, his voice carrying across the relatively quiet section of the bar. "Sitting all alone like some kind of reject." His friends snickered, emboldened by their leader's attention to the solitary figure. They had no idea about Marcus's background or his recent struggles. To them, he was simply another target for their evening's entertainment. Marcus heard the comment but chose to ignore it, taking his first sip of beer since sitting down. He had dealt with ignorant civilians before and knew that engaging would only make the situation worse. His military training had taught him discipline and restraint, qualities that served him well in moments like these. The bartender, an older man named Pete who had served Marcus's father years ago, noticed the tension beginning to build. Pete had seen enough bar fights in his decades behind the counter to recognize the warning signs. He moved closer to Marcus's end of the bar, ready to intervene if necessary. Derek, feeling emboldened by his friend's encouragement and the alcohol flowing through his system, decided to escalate the situation. He strutted over toward Marcus's side of the bar, his entourage following like loyal servants eager to witness their leader's performance. "Excuse me, buddy," Derek said, his tone dripping with false politeness. "You've been sitting there nursing that same beer all night. This is a bar, not a library. Maybe you should head home if you're not going to participate in the fun." Marcus looked up from his beer, his calm brown eyes meeting Derek's bloodshot blue ones. Years of military service had taught him to assess threats quickly and accurately. These weren't enemy combatants or dangerous insurgents. They were simply spoiled young men looking for trouble because their sheltered lives had never taught them the real meaning of conflict. "I'm fine right here, thanks," Marcus replied quietly, his voice steady and controlled. He turned his attention back to the television, hoping the group would lose interest and find someone else to bother. But Derek had tasted blood in the water, and his predatory instincts were now fully engaged. He had built his reputation among his friends by never backing down from what he perceived as challenges to his authority. Marcus's calm dismissal felt like a direct insult to his status as the group's alpha. "Did you hear that, guys?" Derek announced loudly enough for half the bar to hear. "This antisocial weirdo thinks he's too good to talk to us. Must be one of those paranoid loners you hear about on the news." The comment drew uncomfortable looks from other patrons, many of whom recognized Marcus from his high school days when he had been a popular athlete and honor student. They remembered when he enlisted right after graduation, full of patriotic fervor and determination to serve his country. Now he sat before them changed, and they weren't sure how to process the transformation. Marcus's jaw tightened slightly, but he maintained his composure. He had faced down Taliban fighters and survived explosions that had killed good men. He wasn't about to be intimidated by a group of drunk college kids who had never faced real adversity in their comfortable lives. The situation was rapidly approaching a point of no return, with Derek's ego demanding satisfaction and Marcus's military training screaming at him to maintain control. Neither man realized they were about to cross paths with forces that would forever change their understanding of respect, sacrifice, and the true meaning of strength. The tension in Murphy's bar reached a breaking point as Derek's harassment continued to escalate. What had started as casual mockery was now becoming something much more sinister and personal. Derek seemed to feed off the attention he was receiving from both his friends and the growing number of patrons who had stopped their conversations to watch the confrontation unfold. "Come on, man," Derek pressed, moving closer to Marcus's bar stool. "We're just trying to be friendly here. Don't you want to make some new friends? Or are you too damaged to have normal conversations with people?" The word damaged hit Marcus like a physical blow. It was the same term he had used to describe himself during his darkest moments in the military hospital, when the phantom pain in his missing leg felt like nothing compared to the emotional wounds that refused to heal. Hearing it used so casually by someone who had never sacrificed anything for anyone else ignited a spark of anger that Marcus had to work hard to suppress. Pete, the bartender, stepped forward, his weathered face showing clear concern. "Derek, that's enough. Why don't you and your friends head back to your pool game and leave this gentleman alone?" Derek turned on Pete with surprising venom. "Mind your own business, old man. We're not causing any trouble here, just having a conversation with our new friend." He gestured mockingly toward Marcus, who remained seated and silent, his hands now clenched into fists on the bar top. The confrontation was drawing more attention from other patrons. A middle-aged woman near the jukebox pulled out her phone, unsure whether to call for help, but sensing that the situation was spiraling out of control. Two construction workers at a nearby table exchanged worried glances, debating whether they should intervene. Ryan, Derek's cousin, decided to join the harassment with his own contribution. "Hey, maybe he's one of those shell-shocked veterans you see on the streets. You know, the crazy ones who can't handle normal life anymore." The comment sent a ripple of uncomfortable silence through the bar. Even Derek's other friends seemed to realize they had crossed a line, but the momentum of the situation was carrying them forward like a runaway train. Marcus's breathing became more controlled and measured, a technique he had learned in anger management therapy to prevent situations from escalating beyond his control. Tommy, the shortest member of Derek's group, noticed Marcus's deliberate breathing and misinterpreted it as fear. "Look, guys, I think we're scaring him. Maybe he needs his security blanket or something." The laughter from Derek's crew was forced and hollow, but it was loud enough to mask the sound of the bar's front door opening. 3 men entered quietly, shaking rain from their jackets and scanning the room with the practiced awareness of people accustomed to assessing potentially dangerous situations. The newcomers were unremarkable at first glance: average height, athletic builds, and casual clothing that could have belonged to any group of friends meeting for drinks. But their eyes held the same distant intensity that marked Marcus's gaze, and their movements carried the subtle precision of individuals trained for combat. The tallest of the 3, a man with graying temples and calm blue eyes, was Commander James Mitchell, a Navy SEAL with 22 years of service. Beside him stood Petty Officer First Class Anthony Rodriguez, whose quiet demeanor masked an impressive record of successful missions in some of the world's most dangerous locations. The third man, Chief Petty Officer Michael Chen, possessed the kind of situational awareness that came from years of operations where inattention could mean death. They had come to Murphy's Bar specifically to meet Marcus, whom they had heard about through military networks. Veterans of Marcus's unit had reached out to local SEAL teams, concerned about his isolation and adjustment struggles. Tonight was supposed to be an informal meetup, a chance for Marcus to connect with other service members who understood the challenges of transitioning back to civilian life. Instead, they walked into a confrontation that made their trained instincts immediately alert. Commander Mitchell's eyes quickly assessed the situation: one veteran clearly being harassed by multiple civilians, a bartender trying unsuccessfully to de-escalate, and a crowd of onlookers uncertain how to respond. Derek, oblivious to the new arrivals, continued his verbal assault on Marcus. "You know what your problem is, buddy? You think the world owes you something just because you went overseas and probably spent the whole time hiding in some air-conditioned base." The statement was so ignorant and offensive that several patrons audibly gasped. Derek's own friends looked increasingly uncomfortable, finally beginning to realize that their leader's behavior had crossed every line of basic human decency. Marcus slowly turned to face Derek directly for the first time since the harassment began. His voice, when he spoke, was quietly controlled but carried an undertone of steel that made smart people step back. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Marcus said simply. Derek, misreading Marcus's restraint as weakness, decided to deliver what he thought would be the knockout blow. "Oh, I think I do. I think you're just another government welfare case looking for sympathy because you couldn't hack it when things got tough." The silence that followed Derek's words was deafening. Even the background music seemed to fade as the entire bar processed what had just been said. Derek stood there grinning, proud of his verbal assault, completely unaware that he had just demonstrated the kind of ignorance and callousness that revealed everything wrong with his character. Commander Mitchell exchanged glances with his teammates. They had planned to introduce themselves to Marcus quietly, but the situation had changed dramatically. No veteran should have to endure this kind of treatment, especially not alone. The 3 SEALs began moving toward the confrontation with the fluid coordination of a unit that had operated together for years. They didn't hurry or make any threatening gestures, but their approach carried an unmistakable sense of purpose that caught the attention of everyone in the bar. Derek finally noticed the approaching men and turned to face them with the same arrogant confidence he had shown throughout the evening. He assumed they were just more local patrons coming to watch the show he had created. "Don't worry, guys," Derek announced loudly. We're just having a little educational conversation with our friend here about the real world. Commander Mitchell stopped directly behind Derek, close enough to speak in a normal tone that somehow seemed to carry more authority than all of Derek's shouting combined. "Is that what you call it?" Mitchell asked quietly. Derek spun around, suddenly finding himself face to face with three men whose presence seemed to fill the space around them with a quiet intensity he had never experienced before. For the first time since the confrontation began, doubt flickered across his face. But Derek had built his entire identity around never backing down, and alcohol had stripped away what little judgment he possessed. Instead of recognizing the danger in the situation, he doubled down on his aggressive behavior. "Yeah, that's exactly what I call it," Derek said, trying to match Mitchell's calm tone, but failing to hide the slight tremor in his voice. "Unless you've got a problem with free speech." Anthony Rodriguez stepped slightly to Mitchell's left, while Michael Chen moved to the right, creating a subtle formation that blocked Derek's easy escape routes without appearing threatening to casual observers. It was the kind of tactical positioning that happened automatically after years of training and combat experience. "Free speech," Mitchell repeated thoughtfully, as if considering the concept for the first time. "That's an interesting phrase coming from someone who spent the last 30 minutes trying to silence a Marine who actually fought to protect that right." The word Marine seemed to echo through the bar like a thunderclap. Suddenly, Derek's victim was no longer an anonymous target, but a member of America's most elite fighting force. Someone who had earned respect through blood and sacrifice, while Derek had earned nothing but his father's money. Derek's face flushed red as he realized that his evening's entertainment had just transformed into something far more serious than he had bargained for. The atmosphere in Murphy's bar had completely transformed. What moments ago had been a typical Friday night gathering had become an impromptu classroom where lessons about respect, sacrifice, and true strength were about to be taught by masters of the subject. Derek's face cycled through multiple shades of red as the reality of his situation began to sink in. He found himself surrounded by three men whose very presence seemed to command attention from everyone in the room. The casual conversations that had provided background noise throughout the evening had stopped entirely, leaving only the sound of rain against windows and the barely audible hum of the television. Commander Mitchell's voice remained calm and measured, but every word carried the weight of absolute authority. "Sergeant Thompson here lost his leg serving his country in Afghanistan. He was leading a convoy escort mission when his vehicle hit an improvised explosive device. 3 of his fellow Marines died in that explosion." The silence in the bar became even more profound. Several patrons looked down at their drinks, suddenly ashamed that they had witnessed Derek's harassment without intervening. Marcus himself seemed surprised to hear his story told so matter-of-factly, unaware that his reputation had preceded him into this confrontation. Derek's friends had completely abandoned any pretense of supporting their leader. Tommy and Jake had backed away toward the pool table, while Brad and Ryan looked like they wanted to disappear entirely. The comfortable arrogance they had shared in Derek's reflected glory evaporated when faced with men who had earned their confidence through actual accomplishment rather than inherited privilege. I didn't know," Derek stammered, his earlier bravado replaced by obvious discomfort. "How was I supposed to know that?" Anthony Rodriguez spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that revealed his Texas roots. "You weren't supposed to know anything about this man's service record? But you were supposed to treat him with basic human decency, regardless of who he was or what he'd been through." Michael Chen added his own perspective with the quiet intensity of someone who chose his words carefully. "See, that's the difference between us and you. We don't need to know someone's background to treat them with respect. Respect isn't something you earn by demanding it. It's something you give because it's the right thing to do." Derek looked around desperately for support from his friends, but found only averted eyes and uncomfortable shifting. The young men who had eagerly participated in humiliating Marcus now wanted nothing to do with the consequences of their actions. Pete the bartender, emboldened by the presence of the SEALs, stepped forward with newfound confidence. "Derek, I think it's time for you and your friends to settle your tab and head home for the night." But Commander Mitchell raised a hand slightly, indicating that the evening's education was far from complete. "Actually, I think there's still something important that needs to happen here." He turned to address the entire bar, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. "Most of you probably don't know much about military service. That's okay. Not everyone is called to serve in that way. But I want you to understand something about the man sitting at that bar." Mitchell gestured toward Marcus, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, his face showing a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. Sergeant Thompson didn't just lose his leg in Afghanistan. He spent 14 months in that hellhole, leading patrols through areas where every step could be your last. He saved countless Afghan civilians from Taliban brutality, and he brought his Marines home alive from missions that should have been suicide runs. The commander's voice grew stronger as he continued. When that IED went off, Sergeant Thompson's first concern wasn't his own injuries. Even with his leg mangled beyond repair, he organized the evacuation of wounded Marines and coordinated the response that prevented additional casualties. He spent 4 hours in surgery and 3 months in physical rehabilitation, all while dealing with survivors' guilt and post-traumatic stress. Derek's face had gone pale as the true magnitude of his ignorance and cruelty became clear. He had spent the evening mocking a genuine American hero, someone who had sacrificed more for his country than Derek could possibly comprehend. Rodriguez continued the lesson with his own contribution. "Every freedom you enjoy, the right to speak your mind, the right to gather in places like this, the right to live without fear of foreign invasion, exists because men like Sergeant Thompson were willing to put their lives on the line to protect it." Chen stepped closer to Derek, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that somehow seemed more intimidating than shouting would have been. "You spent tonight exercising the free speech that his sacrifice helped preserve, and you used it to attack the very person who defended your right to have it." The irony was not lost on anyone in the room. Derek had invoked free speech to justify his harassment, apparently unaware that his ability to speak freely had been purchased with the blood of people he held in contempt. Mitchell turned his attention directly to Marcus, who had been listening to the defense of his service with obvious discomfort. "Sergeant, these gentlemen owe you an apology. But more than that, everyone in this room owes you a debt of gratitude that can never be fully repaid." Marcus finally spoke, his voice quiet but clear. "I didn't serve for gratitude. I served because it was my duty." The simple statement carried more dignity and power than all of Derek's bluster combined. It was the response of someone who understood that true strength came from service to others rather than dominance over them. Commander Mitchell nodded respectfully. "That's exactly why you deserved better treatment than you received tonight." Derek found his voice again, though it came out as a barely audible whisper. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I was drunk and stupid, and I'm sorry." The apology was clearly sincere, born from genuine shame rather than fear of consequences. Derek's entire worldview had been challenged and found wanting in the space of a few minutes. The entitled young man who had walked into the bar, believing the world revolved around his comfort, had encountered something larger than himself, for perhaps the first time in his privileged life. Marcus looked at Derek for a long moment before nodding slightly. "Apology accepted. Just remember this feeling the next time you're tempted to judge someone you don't know." The 3 SEALs stepped back, their mission of education complete. The immediate crisis had passed, but the lessons taught would resonate far beyond this single evening. Rodriguez approached the bar and ordered drinks for himself and his teammates, while Chen engaged Marcus in quiet conversation about mutual military contacts. Derek and his friends left quietly, their earlier arrogance replaced by thoughtful silence. The young men would spend the rest of the evening, and many nights afterward, reflecting on their encounter with real heroes and their own behavior when faced with someone who had sacrificed for others. The other patrons in Murphy's bar gradually returned to their conversations, but the atmosphere remained different. Several people approached Marcus throughout the rest of the evening to thank him for his service or simply to shake his hand. The veteran who had entered the bar feeling isolated and disconnected found himself surrounded by a community that finally understood his value. Commander Mitchell raised his beer in a quiet toast. To all those who serve, and to those who never made it home to enjoy evenings like this one. The toast was echoed throughout the bar, a moment of genuine respect for sacrifice that Derek's harassment had inadvertently created. Sometimes the most important lessons came from the most unexpected sources, and tonight had provided an education in respect that no one present would ever forget. Marcus smiled for the first time in months, finally understanding that he wasn't as alone as he had believed. The brotherhood of service extended beyond active duty, creating connections that could bridge any gap between military and civilian life when both sides approached each other with open hearts and genuine respect. Outside, the storm that had raged all evening was finally beginning to clear, promising better weather ahead.